Hey guys, today we're going to take a look at Standard 1 in preparation for our EOC. So make sure that you're on Standard 1.1 and just follow along with me. Standard 1 deals a lot with colonization of the New World, the 3 colonial regions, and the early United States. Okay, so we're going to start off with motives for colonization. So we've got 2 primary motives for colonizing the New World, and those were, of course, religious being the first, and economic being the second. All right, so for the religious motivations for colonization, we're talking mainly about New England and the Puritans seeking religious tolerance in the New World, okay? For economic, we're looking mostly at the southern colonies and their desire to come to the New World to look for resources such as gold, but also to form plantations and grow cash crops and participate in trade in that way, okay? All right, taking a closer look at the colonial regions, we need to make sure that we can differentiate between the 3 regions, New England, Mid-Atlantic, and Southern, in these categories: religion, society, politics, and their economy, okay, with the exception of the Mid-Atlantic. For the Mid-Atlantic, we're only looking at religion and economy. So in New England, like we said before, we're looking at the Puritans. Okay, and the Puritans were coming to New England for religious freedom. However, only for themselves. So they didn't have a whole lot of tolerance for other religions. Okay, not a whole lot of tolerance. All right, so, and we'll talk about some key beliefs of the Puritans and sort of their philosophy going forward. Okay. Religion in the Mid-Atlantic region. We see some dissenters from the Puritans actually get kind of pushed out of New England into the Mid-Atlantic region. And because of that, we see a lot more tolerance and diversity in the Mid-Atlantic region. So we've got limited diversity and tolerance. And kind of a good example of that would be the Quakers. All right, so the Quakers are a good example of that. Also, you could put on there the Catholics in Maryland, even though we're starting to get a little south there. Okay, religion in the southern colonies wasn't much of a motive, okay? So not a motive. However, that's not that they didn't practice any religion. Most of the colonists moving into the southern region remained Anglican, okay? They remained part of the Church of England. All right? Okay, moving on to society. For New England, we can say even though they've got this sort of lack of tolerance, their society was much more egalitarian than some other regions, especially the South. Okay, so egalitarian society. All right, and what that means is that people were relatively equal. Okay, so as long as you were part of the church, as long as you were part of the local church, then your voice was heard. Okay, as long as you weren't disagreeing or dissenting with the church, then your voice could be heard. However, with that, the church was, of course, the center of it. So even though society was egalitarian, it was dominated by the clergy. So clergy dominated. All right. And clergy is just another word for the ministers, the preachers, the pastors. Okay? Society for the southern region is what we call hierarchical, okay? I know it's a little hard to say, hierarchical. There's a hierarchy to it, okay? Oh, there we go. All right, so there was sort of this top-down approach where you had the landowners at the top, and of course at the very bottom were the poor and the enslaved. Okay, so we're looking at plantation slavery here. So landowning elite, so they're at the top, and then plantation slavery. We'll just say slave at the bottom. Draw a little triangle there. All right, landowning elite at the top, slave at the bottom. And of course you had your various groups in between depending on their wealth and the amount of land that they owned. But land was really the source of power there. Okay, for politics. So up in New England, we have ideas about popular government. Popular government. Okay, so power of the people, that sort of thing. These ideas were exercised in town meetings. A lot of these town meetings were held, guess where? The church. Okay, so once again, it kind of reflects that egalitarian society. It was in many ways very democratic. All right, very democratic. Okay, the politics of the South. This is where we start to get or see examples of representative government. All right, so a good example of this would be like the Virginia House of Burgesses, right? We'll say VA House of Burgesses. Now, even though this is a representative form of government, we've got to remember that these representative bodies are still dominated by the aristocrats, right? The wealthy and powerful of society, and you really only had representation if you owned land, okay? All right, for the economy of New England, we're talking about commerce, shipbuilding, and fishing, okay? So lots of things that depend on the ocean and trade. So commerce, shipbuilding, and fishing. All right. For the Mid-Atlantic, we're looking at staple crops, and what that means, we're talking about corn, wheat, different grains, things like that. So staple crops. And a lot of it is going to be family farms. Okay. And then for the southern economy, you all know this, cash crops. Okay, and the examples for the cash crops right now in the South, we're looking at tobacco, mostly in Virginia and parts of North Carolina, rice in South Carolina, and then also indigo in South Carolina. All right, and all of that is being grown on plantations, family farms as well, but a lot of plantation agriculture, and of course they're using or utilizing slave labor. Okay, slave labor in the South. Okay, so the economy for all of these places, it's very dependent on or influenced by the geography of the region, right? So that's a big part of it. Because New England has a much cooler climate, a shorter growing season, rockier soil, they don't focus as much on agriculture as the rest of the country, okay? But they do have a lot of natural harbors. They've got, access to timber to build ships. So their economy focused on those things. For the southern economy, because they had those long growing seasons, because they had the arable land to grow these crops, they focus on agriculture, cash crop agriculture in particular, because they were located closer to the Caribbean, they had access to slave labor. So that's why, or one of the reasons why slave labor grows in the South more so than other places. And the Mid-Atlantic, it's kind of a mix between New England and the southern regions, okay? And that's one of the reasons why society and politics isn't really assessed for the Mid-Atlantic, is because it really depends on which colonies you were in the Mid-Atlantic, on whether they were closer to how New England, was doing things, or how the South was doing things. Okay, so let's move on to our next section, kind of going back to New England and the Puritans for a second. So religion in the colonies. In New England, we've got John Winthrop in Massachusetts, and he's the one kind of coming over to the New World with the Puritans, and this is where he gives his sort of his famous sermon where he calls the new colonies here in the New World to be a city on a hill, okay? A city on a hill. That they're going to be this bright example of what Christian living, of what godly living is going to look like, that they're going to be a beacon for the rest of the world to follow, and that God is going to be with them and see that they succeed, because that's their mission, okay? And they're coming over here touting religious freedom, that they're being persecuted in Europe, so they're coming to the New World to practice their religion the way they see fit. But this whole religious freedom thing is kind of a myth, because even though they're fleeing persecution, they are also persecuting their own dissenters in the New World, okay? So we see several people in the Puritan communities that get persecuted, all right? So two dissenters that were exiled. We've got Roger Williams, all right, and Anne Hutchinson. Oops. We'll just do last names. All right, so both of them dissented against the Puritan church in various ways, and because of that, they were exiled from the Puritan communities and would basically kind of be pushed into other parts of New England and also into the Mid-Atlantic region as well. Okay, so some religious aspects in the Mid-Atlantic colonies. We have William Penn in Pennsylvania, who is a Quaker, okay, and the Quakers get started in Pennsylvania, or at least get a foundation in Pennsylvania, so we have the Quakers. And then we have Lord Baltimore in Maryland, where he sets up a refuge for Catholics. All right. And Catholics were getting a lot of persecution in England during the time period, and the Puritans were, of course, no friends to the Catholics either. Okay, going back to economy, the colonial economy. So triangular trade. Let's talk about triangular trade for a second. So triangular trade, if you can envision a map of North America, the Atlantic Ocean in the middle, Europe, and Africa, okay? And basically a big triangle connecting those three areas together, right? That's the triangular trade that we're talking about here, how goods are moving from each of those places to the others. So from the colonies, we have mostly raw materials, right? So these are all of those different crops that are being grown in the New World. These are the pelts that are being hunted, okay, the different materials that are coming from the New World. And those materials are mainly going to Europe, also some to Africa, but mainly to Europe, all right? So from Europe to the colonies in Africa, we have mostly manufactured goods, okay? And what that includes, anything that takes raw materials and then processes it into something else. So whether it be furniture or clothing or tools or guns, any of those things that require the manufacturing process, even things like processed food or rum would be a good example that's being made in Europe with the materials, some materials coming from the colonies, and then is being shipped back out, sold in Europe, sold in the colonies, and sold, yes, in Africa as well. Okay, so what is coming from Africa in this trade? Primarily two things: slaves. Okay, so slaves, slave laborers, and also gold. All right, and there are other natural resources that are going to come out of Africa as well, but really kind of colonization and growing empire in Africa is going to be a little bit down the road. So right now, mainly Europeans are trading manufactured goods in Africa to purchase slaves, okay, to purchase slaves. All right, so this triangular trade, all of the different empires that are trying to build footholds in the New World and sort of gain a foothold or control of this triangular trade, they are practicing an economic system called mercantilism. All right, so in mercantilism, they are trying to regulate the economy to where they are importing as few things as possible, meaning buying as few things as possible. They're providing for themselves, and they are controlling as many resources as possible to sell to others. Okay, they want to be the place where everyone buys everything. Okay, they want to be the Walmart. All right, they don't want to have to go somewhere else to buy goods, and they want everyone to buy goods from them. Okay, and Britain is practicing this. Okay, the UK is practicing this, and the laws that they're going to pass to try to enforce mercantilism are going to be called the Navigation Acts. All right, the Navigation Acts govern colonial trade, but were not strictly enforced. So this enforcement, all right, they're making money off the colonies. The colonies are doing their own thing. So this lack of enforcement of the Navigation Act is known as salutary neglect. Okay, salutary neglect. So basically, Britain, they're having a good time. They're making cash off the colonies. The colonies are making cash themselves. They're also developing their own systems of government. They're developing their own cultures, their own kind of societal norms and traditions, and they're slowly kind of growing away from Britain, but nobody really cares because everybody's happy, everybody's making money, okay? All right, so salutary neglect is in place. Britain is kind of neglecting the colonies, letting them do their own thing. Now, ports, just kind of as an important aside here, major ports for the colonial regions, we've got Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, okay? Now, you'll see a lot of these are in the New England and Middle colonies, Charleston being the biggest one and really the only one in the southern area. But I do want to kind of highlight, New York here because if you guys remember us talking about it in previous classes, New York is a good example of diversity, right? All right, a good example of the level of diversity that we see in the Mid-Atlantic region. So I've seen this question 100 times, referring to which of the three colonial regions is the most diverse in some shape or form, and the answer is always the Mid-Atlantic, okay? And remember that because New York is in the Mid-Atlantic. New York, big, diverse city. Hopefully that will help you remember that, okay? All right, moving on to the next page. Okay, so the next section here, we're taking a look at basically the foundations of government, okay, coming from England, things that we brought over to the New World, things that we implemented in our colonial governments, and things that will eventually be worked into our American government, our U.S. government, okay? So, a constitutional government, what does that mean? A constitutional government is a limited government. All right, so that means we've placed limits on what the government can and cannot do. Okay, our written constitution is sort of the law of the land, right? It is the handbook that the government has to follow. Okay, so a lot of these constitutional Republican traditions, okay, they're coming from England. We're bringing them with us as colonists to the New World. All right, so we're getting these from several different English traditions, and one of those is the Magna Carta. Okay, so the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, was signed by King John in 1215. The Magna Carta limited the power of the English monarch and recognized the rights of individuals in the following ways. Okay, first one is taxation by consent. Right, so basically the king or the government, it can't just tax however it wishes. It has to get approval from the people through representation, through their representatives. Okay. So, of course, that's going to come up later when we talk more about the Revolution. All right, the next one, trial by jury. Okay, so trial by jury, right, it just says, it basically means that, the king can't just accuse you of a crime, convict you of it himself, and just throw you in jail whenever he wants. He can't just let you rot in the dungeon, okay? You get a trial. Not only do you get a trial, but you get a trial by a jury of your peers, okay? People around you, all right? And the next one is the rule of law, okay? Everyone obeys the law, even the king. No one's above the law. The king can't just do what he wants to do. He's got to follow the law. You can't just do whatever you want to do. You got to follow the law. So the law is sort of the top. The law is at the top. Okay, so getting more into sort of the British government and the aspects that we're bringing over here, English monarchs had to get the approval of Parliament, all right, for all taxes. So Parliament is kind of like, it's Britain's Congress. It's their legislature, okay, their legislative body. Ours is Congress, theirs is Parliament. Ours is kind of modeled after Parliament in many ways, okay? Parliament was a representative body made up of nobles, bishops, and landowners. So in the 1600s, the Stuart kings clashed with Parliament, leading to the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. Glorious Revolution of 1688. So basically what the Glorious Revolution does is it gets rid of absolute monarchs. It gets rid of kings who think they can do whatever they want. That's what the Glorious Revolution tried to do and did so successfully. Okay, so it replaces the Stuart kings with William and Mary. Okay, so William and Mary signed the English Bill of Rights. Okay, which established the following principle: that the Parliament has more authority or more power than the king because they represent the people. Yes, the king represents his people too, but sort of in a different way, okay? So Parliament has authority higher than the king, all right? And so this Bill of Rights kind of lays that out, that the people, well, actually really Parliament, has certain rights that the king can't just, walk all over. And of course, we're going to take ideas like that when we're looking at the relationship between our Congress and our president, and also the relationship between our states and our government and our people in our government. All right, the English Bill of Rights guaranteed many of the same liberties that Americans are guaranteed by our Bill of Rights, including freedom of speech, freedom to petition the government, the right to bear arms, and protection from cruel and unusual punishments. Okay, and a lot of this is coming from a certain British philosopher named John Locke, okay, who wrote about the idea of natural rights, rights that you're born with, okay? And he lists those rights as life, liberty, and property. All right, and of course, we kind of adapt that: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, good old Thomas Jefferson. All right, so moving forward, consent of the governed. What does that mean? Consent of the governed means that the government works for the people. Okay? Government works for the people. They have to have our approval to do things. They have to have our consent to rule us. Okay? They can't be dictators. All right, so the government works for the people. And then another concept coming from John Locke was right of revolution or right to revolution, where if the government isn't doing that, if they're not working for the people, then the people may remove their government. All right, so people may remove their government. All right, even with the use of violence or force if necessary. Okay? All right, so the English colonists brought these ideas with them to the colonies where they created their own representative bodies and made their laws. So all of these different things influence the development of our colonial governments, okay? And each colony, like we discussed earlier, from New England all the way down south, they're going to have their own flavor of this. They're going to have their own form of government, okay? So with all of this happening, Parliament pursued a policy of, remember, salutary neglect. All right, with the colonies leaving them alone. However, this would change with the French and Indian War, which is what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so Parliament starts taxing the colonies and things start changing. And the big event that's going to cause that starts in 1754 and ends in 1763, and that is the French and Indian War. All right. So after the French and Indian War, Parliament decided to quarter troops. That means to have troops stay in the colonies. Quarter troops in the American colonies, and that the colonists should pay to maintain these troops. So colonists are being forced to pay for these troops, even though they don't necessarily want the troops there. The new restrictions and taxes Parliament placed on the colonies included, there's a big list here. We've got in 1763 the Proclamation Line. Okay, sometimes it's called the Royal Proclamation Line, but the Proclamation Line of 1763, which restricted colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, so this was a big deal for several reasons. First off, the Proclamation Line gave a bunch of land to Native Americans, or at least it left that land reserved for Native Americans. And the colonists didn't like that. They saw that as the crown taking away land from them, okay? The second thing is, this land that was reserved, a lot of it was the land that the colonists had just helped fight for in the French and Indian War. So they saw it as, okay, the government is going to not let me go into the land that I fought for the crown, for Britain to gain. What's up with that? Okay, so colonists didn't like it. A lot of them actually completely ignored this law and settled over the line anyway. Okay, so in 1764, we get the Sugar Act. All right, so with the Sugar Act, it is an import tax on foreign sugar. All right, also known as a tariff, right? Import tax on foreign sugar. So remember, going back to mercantilism, Great Britain wanted to have the largest slice of the pie, right? They had colonies that produced sugar, and they wanted to make sure that everyone in the British Empire bought sugar from the British, okay? They didn't want anyone getting sugar from outside places, because that meant money was leaving the British system and going to the Dutch or the French or somebody else, one of their competitors, okay? So they put a tax on foreign sugar so that people would be less likely to buy that foreign sugar. And this is going to going to hurt some colonial traders, okay, colonial merchants who are dealing with foreign sugar. All right, so they don't like that. They don't like Britain meddling with their trade, because remember, they've been, up to this point, they've been practicing salutary neglect, where they haven't really gotten involved all that much. Okay, 1765, we have the Stamp Act. So with the Stamp Act, we have a tax on legal documents and printed materials. All right, so if you have like any sorts of contracts or forms that you have to fill out, you have to pay special taxes for those things, as well as things as simple as newspapers, printed materials. Those were being taxed as well. And this is not a tariff, right? This is an internal tax, because it's all goods within the empire, okay? And people certainly didn't like this, and especially the socioeconomic class that it affected the most, which was sort of this rising or growing professional middle class, that use a lot of government forms and documents and manifests, things like that, and also the largest part of the population that consumes printed materials such as newspapers. They felt like they were kind of being targeted by these British taxes. Okay, so this is where we get the battle cry: no taxation without representation. Okay, because the problem here is that in England, there's Parliament, and Parliament approves all of these taxes, right? In Parliament, the people are represented through Parliament. Well, the people in the colonies are not represented in Parliament. So because of that, the people in the colonies felt like they shouldn't have to be paying these taxes. They shouldn't have to be following these laws, because it's not their representatives who are passing them, okay? All right, but they don't stop. 1767, we get the Townshend Acts. All right, the Townshend Acts. So with the Townshend Acts, we have more taxes on imports. All right, more taxes on imports. And all of these included paper, paint, all right, lead, glass, and, of course, the big one, tea. Okay, so it taxed all of those goods. And this is where things start getting a little heated. Okay, so we're entering the road to revolution, sort of the turning point, the turning points that lead up to the revolution. So in 1770, we have the Boston Massacre. All right, so we have a confrontation between British troops and sort of a rowdy mob of colonists. Things don't go so well. The soldiers say that the colonists, start throwing rocks and that they're armed, and the soldiers fire on the crowd of colonists, killing several people and injuring others. So we have this confrontation. And of course, the crown is sort of blamed for this and made out to be the bad guys. Between British troops and colonists. All right. 1773, we have the Tea Act. And this leads to the Boston Tea Party. All right, so basically Parliament grants a monopoly on tea to a company in the British government or tied to the British government, and that leads to the Boston Tea Party. where at that colonists protest these taxes as well as the Tea Act itself by dumping tea, right? Which, of course, costs a lot of money. Boston Harbor. Okay, so they dump tea. 1774, we have the Intolerable Acts. So this is sort of a reaction to what's going on in Boston. All right, so we've got the Boston Tea Party where they're causing property damage. We've got the Boston Massacre where this rowdy mob is coming up against these soldiers. Now, granted, those soldiers fire on the group of colonists there, but from the British perspective, they're seeing Boston as sort of out of control, okay, out of control. And, of course, the colonists are seeing the British as being these terrible, tyrannical oppressors, okay? So the British passed the Intolerable Acts that basically bring about martial law, all right, in Boston. Boston is really the epicenter here, Massachusetts. Okay, so what do these all include? We've got the Boston Port Act. Okay, and that closes the Port of Boston. And that, remember, Boston is in New England. New England's economy is based on their ports and their shipping, so that's really seen as sort of an attack on their way of life. 2, we've got the Massachusetts Government Act. Okay, basically puts Boston under British control, direct British control. All right. We have the Quartering Act, which you guys are all familiar with. Right. More troops, more British troops. In Boston and in people's homes, right? People are having to put these troops up. Okay. Next, we have the Administration of Justice Act. Admin of Justice Act. And what that does is it sends trials to England. And let me talk about why that's important for a second. So a lot of the trials that are going on in Boston are for smugglers. All right, people who are trying to get around all of these taxes by smuggling their goods and not claiming them. So basically, when they're putting these people on trial in Boston, the colonists are kind of supporting each other, right? And they're saying that, each other, they're not guilty, okay? So we have very low conviction rates, even when a lot of these people definitely are smuggling. So Britain decides, well, if we can't get justice here, then we need to send these trials to England. So these guys who are accused of smuggling are actually being shipped off to England to have their trials there. And remember, one of those principles, right, one of those government principles that we brought over to the New World was a trial by a jury. And that means a jury of your peers. And a lot of these Bostonians don't see having a trial in England as being a trial by your peers, okay? So people are upset about that as well. Not to mention, the fact that you're held prisoner on a boat while you get to England, away from your friends and family. Okay, and then the final bit here is the Quebec Act. And basically what the Quebec Act does is it gives land to Canada. Land that was claimed by Massachusetts at the time. And the Crown, really the Crown owns it all anyway. or at least has authority over it, and they set it aside for Canada. Okay? So all of this huge road to revolution, leads finally to 1775, where we have the battles of Lexington and Concord. Okay, and of course you all know this as the first shot heard around the world, right? The first shots, the shot heard around the world, the first shots of the American Revolution. Okay, so the revolution has begun. It's not quite official yet, but we've had the first battle. Here you will see we've got the Declaration of Independence here written there for you, so you can take a look at that. So in April 1775, we just talked about this, the battles of Lexington and Concord. Okay. January 1776, Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. It's a political pamphlet that he writes arguing for independence and why people should support independence. All right, so July 1776, we have our Declaration of Independence finally. All right, it takes 15 months for the colonies to make a full commitment to the revolution. It takes so long because they're looking for a unanimous declaration, okay, a unanimous declaration. And with that unanimous declaration, what they have to have with that is every colony, all 13 of them, right, agreeing that the Declaration of Independence or independence was a good thing, okay, was something that would benefit everyone. And remember, Boston and New England have been kind of the center of all of this. But then you've got areas like the South that had a much stronger connection to England and really didn't always see how it was going to benefit them as much. Because remember, they weren't as deep into trade. Instead, they relied more heavily on England to buy things like their cash crops, okay? So remember, all of the regions were different. Because of their differences, it took longer to get this unanimous declaration, this full commitment to revolution, okay? But we get it, and we get it through the Declaration of Independence, and that is there for you to look at. You will see as you read it a lot of similar ideas that we looked at when we talked about John Locke and sort of the different traditions that we're taking from England. Okay. All right. So moving on, continuing forward here, we have John Locke. All right, as one of the big influencers here. So Locke's ideas of limited government are present throughout the Declaration. We have an appeal here to natural law. Okay, so like I said, with Locke, we have an appeal, through Jefferson, talking about the ideas of Locke in the Declaration, we have this appeal to natural law, okay, which was part of Locke's ideas of natural rights. Okay, the two audiences of the Declaration, we've got an internal audience, which would be the American people themselves, mainly the Loyalists, right? Trying to convince them, okay, either loyalists or people on the fence about independence, trying to convince them this really is the best thing for us, and we've tried to work with the British, but they're not having it, so this is the last straw. This is what we've got to do. And then the external audience, of course, being Britain and the king, okay, all right, and potentially allies, right? Potential allies you could put there. Okay, so natural rights, remember those are coming from Locke. Oh, excuse me, I shouldn't say they come from Locke. The idea is coming from Locke, right? Natural rights, according to the Declaration and according to Locke, come from your creator, okay? And in the Declaration, they're going to be a little bit different than Locke's, right? We've got life, liberty, all right, same so far. And then instead of property, we get the pursuit of happiness, okay? All right, and the purpose of the government is to secure these rights. So he mentions in here also another concept from Locke, the right of revolution. People have the right to overthrow oppressive governments. The colonists have patiently suffered a long train of abuses and usurpations at the hands of the British. This is partially aimed at those in the colonies who still hope for reconciliation with the crown. All right, so basically that whole litany of abuses, that long train of abuses and usurpations, they're trying to convince people still in the colonies, right, who are supporting the crown, we can't. We've tried. All right, all of these things have happened. We've got to do what's right for us. All right, and of course, the target of all of this is not Parliament. The whole thing is targeted at the king. All right, the whole thing is targeted at the king. Okay, so Jefferson continues on with his litany of abuses, where he basically, talks about all the bad things that King George has done, and those are listed here for you: dissolved representative houses, erected multitude of new offices and officers to harass the people, plundered our seas. Okay, he basically blames him for all sorts of terrible things. And maybe not a whole lot of evidence for all of the things, but you kind of get the idea. Okay, so here we go. These united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may have right to do. So basically, there it is. We're independent. Get over it. So the Declaration of Independence allowed the newly independent states to make a full commitment to the Revolution, allowing the Congress and the states to establish sovereign governments and conduct foreign policy. So with the domestic policy, how are they going to run themselves? What is this new federal government going to look like? What is this state going to look like? And it's going to begin with the Articles of Confederation. All right, which is our first governing document, So with the Articles of Confederation, the principles of the Declaration are put in action here. Basically, we have a decentralized government with no independent executive branch. So basically, there's no real president yet. The colonies the states now are working together through a legislature, through the Continental Congress, okay, which is run through, or I should say, is run based on the Articles of Confederation. All right, foreign policy. So with this, with our independence, we are able to form an alliance with France. All right, and this is after the Battle of Saratoga in New York, where it's kind of a turning point in the war. It shows France that we are able to fight and win, and they start supporting us. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. France assists the United States because they are competing with Britain, okay? All right, they are competing with Britain as well. Okay, so although northern states passed laws providing for the gradual emancipation of slaves, and nearly all states stopped supporting churches with tax dollars, implementing the Declaration's ideal that all men are created equal has been a constant work in progress throughout the history of the United States. So even though we see that language used, all men created equal, in our Declaration, we know that that is not going to be a reality for a long time, right? So keep that in mind as we go through the review. Okay, so an influential document, the Declaration of Independence has influenced other declarations of rights in the U.S. and around the world, including the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Texas Declaration of Independence, the Seneca Falls Declaration, which talked about women's rights. We'll talk about that later. And the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, which was written by communists. Okay. So, moving on into more detail with the Articles of Confederation, right? We win the revolution, okay, with France's help. Britain's out of the picture for the most part, and now we have to get down to business in terms of what is this country going to look like? How is it going to run? And we know we started with the Articles of Confederation, right? So, under the Articles of Confederation, it was the first plan of government for the United States, right? So, Articles of Confederation here. Okay, drafted in 1776. The Articles were replaced by the U.S. Constitution in 1789. So let's talk about the differences between the two and why we end up replacing the Articles. So with this idea of Articles and the Constitution, we are kind of debating the idea of federalism, okay? That's the question that's being asked, right? How much power should be left to the states? How much power should be left to the federal government or the central government? So the Articles of Confederation, a firm league of friendship, talking about the relationship between the states, that they're in this firm league of friendship. They're not, actually one big country, but kind of more of a collection or a friendship of smaller countries, okay? So how representation worked under the Articles of Confederation, it was all equal. Each state had equal representation regardless of their size, regardless of their population, any of those things, okay? Now, under the Constitution, right, what was seen as sort of a better plan, a more perfect union, right? Everyone together under this central government. It's going to be split, right? So we're going to have a bicameral legislature where we've got equal representation in the Senate, right, where each state gets one senator, and then we're going to have proportional representation in the House of Representatives. Okay, so there it's going to be based on your state's population, how many reps you have in the House. All right, so taxation, how did it work? Well, under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government couldn't tax, okay? Only states can tax. Only states could tax. All right, so the federal government had a very tough time paying for things because they couldn't levy taxes. They could ask for money, but states were under no obligation to really give it. Okay, here in the Constitution, both can. All right, so states and the federal government can tax. All right, so the federal government could now pay for the things it needed because it could levy taxes on the people. Okay, so powers of Congress. What were the legislative powers under the Articles of Confederation? They pretty much, did everything. So we've got foreign relations, of course, the Army and Navy, or the Armed Forces. And, of course, war goes along with that. And also kind of with foreign relations, we've got ambassadors and treaties. Okay. And then with the Constitution, we just see an increase in powers of Congress, and we're talking about, the federal government with Congress here. So in addition, we get taxation, right? We talked about that. interstate commerce, so that's trade between states. All right. Maintaining or establishing and maintaining the currency. So before the U.S. Constitution, each state could issue its own currency. So think of a South Carolina dollar, a North Carolina dollar, kind of confusing. And then finally, they could crush rebellions, maintain peace and order. Okay? So under the Articles, if you wanted to amend, if you wanted to make a change, you needed every state to agree. It had to be unanimous, which is incredibly difficult to do. Under the U.S. Constitution, it is not that way. You need 2/3 of the Congress to agree, plus 3/4 of the states to ratify one of those changes, one of those amendments, which, of course, we will amend the Constitution many times. Okay? So how did this change happen, this change from the Articles to the U.S. Constitution happen? Well, it happened through the Constitutional Convention. So May through September of 1787 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we see basically representatives coming together to redo, right? They're trying to reform the Articles. They're trying to fix or revise the Articles. So that was the main goal, to revise or amend the Articles. They didn't want to throw it all out, okay? Not at first. But in looking at it, they saw, well, there's not really much we can do to save this thing. We've just got to start over. So that's how we get to the Constitution, okay? And all of this is triggered, okay? All of this is triggered all of this is triggered by Daniel Shay's rebellion, okay? So Daniel Shay, a farmer in Massachusetts, rebels, and the states are having a tough time, Massachusetts is having a tough time putting down that rebellion, and it kind of wakes the government up, and, oh, our federal government needs more power. It needs to be able to handle crises or situations like these when they come up. So, like I said, they're meeting in Pennsylvania for the convention, and we see several conflicts over how things should be changed, but then also compromises to those conflicts. So the first issue we've got here has to do with representation, or really representation is the biggest issue of the Constitutional Convention, what that's going to look like. And we get sort of two proposals, two plans. So the Virginia plan. The Virginia plan calls for a bicameral legislature. Okay, based on population. Both houses based on population. All right, Virginia likes this because Virginia at the time is considered a big state, and with both houses based on population, because they've got a larger population, they get a lot of representation. They like this, okay? Now, of course, who's not going to like this? The small states. So one of those small states, the New Jersey puts forth the New Jersey plan, and with this, they call for a unicameral legislature, right? Only one house. All right, and they want it to be equal, okay? Basically, one vote per state. And the larger states are like, how does that make sense? A state that has the fewest number of people can have equal power to a state with the most people. They basically said that that's not fair to the people. It's making the people of smaller states' votes count more, or at least their citizenship, their representation count more than those of larger states. So with this, Connecticut comes in, okay, and we get the Great Compromise, also sometimes known as the Connecticut Compromise. But what the Great Compromise does is it takes aspects of the Virginia plan and aspects of the New Jersey plan and adds them together, puts them together. So with the Great Compromise, we're going to have a bicameral legislature, like Virginia. All right, so it's got 2 houses. All right, in the upper house, we know it as the Senate. Okay, the upper house will be equal. Each state will get 1 senator. Excuse me, each state will get 2 senators. All right, for a total of 100 eventually, right? Today we have 100. So the upper house equal, each state gets 2 senators. And then we'll have the lower house, which we know as the House of Representatives, and that will be based on population. All right? So that's the compromise that is reached, okay? And there's some other issues like the upper house. It will be indirect, basically, the meaning those senators will be appointed. Those will be appointed, and then the lower population will be voted on. All right. So moving on to the next issue. The next issue has to do with how slaves are going to be counted for representation. So we get the 3/5, not so great, right, compromise. So with the 3/5 compromise, the South, they want their slaves to count towards their population so that they can have more representatives. And the North is like, well, wait a minute, how is that fair? These people, they have no rights, okay? Why should they be represented if they have no political rights? And the South argues, well, they kind of have rights, but we are their caretakers. We're the caretakers of those rights. We hold them in trust. We hold our slaves in trust. And because of that, they still deserve representation. We deserve representation, okay? So we get a compromise here, all right? So for each slave, the total number of slaves, or 3/5 of that total will be counted towards their population and or towards representation. Yeah. So 3/5 of slaves will be counted towards population for representation. All right, now, where's the compromise, right? Okay, so the 3/5 is a compromise, but also it leads to kind of the next section here, the slave trade compromise. They kind of go together. So because the South gets that 3/5, okay, with the slave trade compromise, all right, in 20 years, okay, in 20 years, Congress can regulate the slave trade. All right, and in 20 years' time, we're going to see Congress step in and basically outlaw the international slave trade, not the domestic, interstate slave trade, but the international slave trade, okay? All right, almost finished here. Next is the Electoral College, how that is going to work. Each state will send electors to cast their vote for president, okay? So the president will be selected through the Electoral College. So each state, and these electors are based on population, sends electors to vote for the president, okay? So the number of electors your state gets is the number of senators you have plus representatives. All right, so the representatives, the House, is how your population influences that, okay? So how amendments are going to be changed, we kind of referenced this before, but we've got to have 2/3 of Congress and then 3/4 of the states to ratify. Okay. And that is our Constitution, but of course, we've got to get it ratified. Okay, in order to get the Constitution ratified, the Constitution had to be ratified by conventions in 9 of the 13 states. So it had to get approved in 9 of the 13 states in order to take effect. Okay, so with this, we start to see the formation of, or the rise of 2 factions, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalist. All right, now the Federalists, they supported the Constitution as it was. They supported ratification. Supported, okay, and they wanted a stronger central government. All right, they wanted a strong central government, and they thought that having a strong central government under the Constitution would provide for a better economy and law and order. Okay. Now, the Anti-Federalists, they opposed the Constitution as it was, right? And they did that because they thought that a strong central government could have too much power, that it did not have enough protections for the people in the states. Okay, they were afraid that basically what had happened under the British government would happen all over again. Okay, so some major Federalists who supported the ratification of the Constitution as it was, they wrote a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers, basically a series of arguments saying why the Constitution was good as it was and why it should be ratified. And those, of course, were James Madison, all right, and then Alexander Hamilton, and then finally John Jay. Okay, so moderate anti-federalists, they agreed to support the Constitution, but only if a Bill of Rights was added. All right, and this Bill of Rights would protect or kind of lay out rights that the people had, and it would ensure their protection. And the Federalists saw this as a good compromise. They said, sure thing, we'll do that, you ratify it. And then the first 10 amendments, the first 10 changes to the Constitution right after it's ratified would be known as our Bill of Rights. Okay? All right, so now that we've got the Constitution ratified, let's take a look at some of its principles, okay, how it works. So remember, we talked about how a constitutional government is a limited government. The Constitution is the law of the land. It tells us how our government is going to work. And one of the big principles of this is federalism, that power is going to be divided between a central government, all right, and you can also call this a national government. You could also call this a federal government. Those all mean the same thing. So power would be divided between that entity, that central government, and the state governments. Okay? So we split these powers into delegated, concurrent, and reserved. So delegated powers, those are powers that go for the federal government. Okay? The federal government has those powers. Concurrent powers would be those that would be shared by both. Concurrent means shared by both the state government and federal government. And then reserved powers, those are the powers that are going to be reserved or kept just for the states and the people. So not the federal government. Okay? Okay, so all of this was in an attempt to form an ordered government. Okay, so if you guys remember, one of the big catalysts for all of this happening was Shays' Rebellion, which showed the founders that, hey, we need a stronger central government. Okay, so another principle is the fact that our government is a representative government, also known as republicanism, that we have representatives that represent us in the different levels of government and the different branches of government. Okay, we don't actually ourselves as the people make the law. Instead, our elected representatives do that and carry that out. All right, so with that, we have the next principle, separation of powers. So here we're taking the different powers of the government and we're separating it out into the three branches. And of course, we have the legislative branch, all right, which makes the law. So this would be our Congress. The executive branch, okay, so that would be the president and the various departments that he has, the cabinet. And then lastly, the judicial branch. So that would be the federal courts as well as the Supreme Court, right? So each of those branches has different powers and has its own sort of part to play in the government. Legislative branch makes the laws, executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws and settles disputes, okay? So all of this leads to checks and balances, right? So in addition to separation of powers, the framers proposed a system of checks and balances in order to make sure that the members of one branch of government did not become too powerful or corrupt. So some good examples of this: the president has the power to veto laws passed by Congress. The president, however, can't go on and just make any old treaty he wants with any country. The Senate has to approve those treaties, the legislative branch. Judicial nomination and confirmation. So while the president gets to appoint those things, the legislative branch has to approve those nominations and confirm those nominations. And then, of course, we know the judicial branch has an incredibly strong power, judicial review, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Okay, so now that we have this new government set up, let's talk about what happens next. So in Washington's first cabinet, okay, several of his members, we've got the Secretary of Treasury here, which was Alexander Hamilton. Okay, Secretary of War Henry Knox, Attorney General Edmund Randolph, and then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. And the real conflict is going to be between Hamilton and Jefferson. So with Hamilton and Jefferson, go ahead and write their names here, we see the rise of the first two political parties, okay, the first two-party system. So under Hamilton, we've got the Federalists, and under Jefferson, we've got the Republicans. Now, during this time period, they were known as the Democratic Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republicans, okay? So basically, this chart here is just showing you for each of these issues, federalism through their supporters, where did they stand, who supported them. So on the issue of federalism, remember that division of power between the federal government and state governments. The Federalists favored a strong central government. All right. And the Jeffersonian Republicans were for stronger state governments, okay? They believed in much stronger states' rights. All right, stronger state governments. On this issue of the Constitution, we're talking about how it should be interpreted, how it should be read. The Federalists believed in what we call loose construction or loose interpretation of the Constitution. So basically what that means is you don't necessarily have to take the Constitution word for word. There's room for interpretation. There's a little wiggle room there. in terms of what the government can and can't do, whereas the Jeffersonian Republicans believed in a strict constructionist. Basically, you take the Constitution as it's written, word for word, no room for interpretation, no room for change without going through the official ratification of or amendment process, okay? So strict construction. All right. In terms of the economy, the Federalists believed in more government influence in the economy, and they wanted the economy to be one of banking, commerce, and industry. Whereas for the Jeffersonian Republicans, once again, smaller central government influence, bigger state government influence, and Jefferson really pushed an agrarian economy, one based on agriculture. Okay. All right, national bank. This is basically whether the party agreed that there should be a national bank and that it was constitutional or not. So the Federalists, because of their loose construction of the Constitution, they believed that a national bank was good and was constitutional. Was constitutional, and that it would help the economy. Okay, and of course Jefferson, the exact opposite. Okay, they believed that because of their strict construction, there was nothing in the Constitution that directly said you could have a national bank, so they said nope, it's not constitutional. And Jefferson and the Republicans believed that the government having that much control on the economy through a national bank, it would lead to corruption. Okay. All right, protective tariffs. Remember, protective tariffs are taxes on imported goods that are meant to help protect domestic industries, right? So if you look at the economy under the Federalists, right, they were all about this sort of new domestic industry. So they were in favor of protective tariffs to protect those new domestic industries, okay? In favor of. And the Jeffersonian Republicans, remember, protective tariffs would make things more expensive for them. They would basically be pushed to buy more goods from really, the northern part of the country instead of potentially getting cheaper goods from Europe because of these tariffs. So they opposed those tariffs. It also kind of strained the trade relationship between the South and Europe. All right, so they opposed tariffs. Okay. All right, federal assumption of state war debts. What this is talking about, after the Revolution, several of the states were in debt from fighting the Revolution, and a lot of the states that still had debts to pay, a lot of them were northern states. And the Federalists, okay, who happen to have, a lot of support in the North, they wanted the federal government to assume those war debts so that basically the whole country paid off the debts instead of the individual states being responsible for those debts. All right. So we'll say they support that. Okay. And the Republicans, who most were in the South, said no way, because a lot of them had already paid off their debts, and they believed, okay, we had to pay off our debts. It's not our fault you don't have them paid off yet. The federal government should not assume those debts. So they opposed that. Okay, so for supporters for each, as you can tell, it's pretty regionally split, okay? So supporters, most of the supporters of the Federalists are going to be in the North. Many are going to be bankers, lawyers, industrialists, some merchants, all right? Whereas for the Jeffersonian Republicans, we have a lot of people in the South, landowners, farmers, all right? And kind of for supporters for the Jeffersonian Republicans, I want to point out a word that Jefferson said was really important, kind of what he called the yeoman farmer. The yeoman farmer, this sort of middle-class, landowning American who farmed for a living, and he saw them as sort of the ideal American, okay? So you can see lots of differences between these two groups, okay? So Washington is sort of having to play referee between these two guys, so things were not going well in terms of peace in the home. So when Washington leaves his second term in office, when he leaves, he gives a farewell address, and in his farewell address, he urged Americans to avoid two things, okay? And those two things were political partisanship. Basically exactly what was happening, political parties, okay? He thought that it was going to basically tear the country apart. And then the second thing was entangling alliances. Basically, stay out of other people's businesses. You can trade with the world, but you need to stay out of their political issues, their social issues. Don't get involved in entangling alliances. Don't get involved in foreign wars. Just stay out of all of that. And that will sort of put America, that second one will put America on a path of isolationism for a while, okay? And, of course, political partisanship, that just didn't, no one listened to that at all. Okay, so after Washington, we have the Adams administration. So two of the key things that come along in the Adams administration, we've got the Alien and Sedition Acts, which was passed by the Adams administration, or passed by Congress during the Adams administration in 1798. So Adams there supported it. And what did it do? It put restrictions on citizenship and political speech. So why is that important? Political speech. So we have immigrants coming into the United States during this time period, and many of these immigrants were supporting the Jeffersonian Republicans. Okay, a lot of them were supporting the Jeffersonian Republicans. And Adams was a Federalist. And Adams and the other Federalists in power during his administration, they were worried that basically the Jeffersonian Republicans were about to just overturn the government. They were about to flood the government, at least in office. Okay, they were going to be elected into all of these offices. So the Alien and Sedition Acts were laws that were put in place to try to stem that tide. And Adams referenced all sorts of things like national security, and that many of these immigrants are trying to destabilize the country and all sorts of things like that. But at the end of the day, it was sort of a political move that we would probably see as very unconstitutional today. And because of that, because of the Alien and Sedition Acts, we get the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which aren't laws, okay? They're not laws. They're more of just kind of statements made by Jefferson and Madison. And what they say is, hey, if the federal government passes some law that the states think is unconstitutional, they don't have to follow it, okay? So basically saying that, this is directly aimed at the Alien and Sedition Acts. So state legislatures, states can nullify or ignore, right? Nullify unconstitutional laws. So really here, Jefferson is saying that states interpret the Constitution. States can determine whether or not a law is constitutional. Now remember, these resolutions are not laws. They're just statements made by Jefferson and Madison, kind of their opinions, okay? So in 1800, we have the election of 1800, also known as the Revolution of 1800. And with this, Jefferson is elected president, and we get the Jeffersonian Republican majority in both houses of Congress. So both of those things happen with the Revolution of 1800. So it's exactly what Adams feared, why he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, but it happened anyway. Okay, so before leaving office, John Adams appointed several federal judges. All right, he's trying to use his power as president to fill the government with as many Federalist politicians as he possibly can before he has to leave office and, of course, Jefferson take over. So he appoints several federal judges who would serve life terms and be able to undermine Jefferson's Republican administration from the bench. These included John Marshall, who Adams appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So Chief Justice is the top judge. All right. So with this, we get a very important court case, Marbury versus Madison. All right. And from Marbury versus Madison, it establishes the principle of judicial review. Okay, say it with me. Marbury versus Madison equals judicial review. Marbury versus Madison equals judicial review. I want you to say that over and over and over because it's so important. So, what is judicial review? Okay, judicial review from Marbury versus Madison says that the Supreme Court has the authority to interpret the Constitution, specifically, in this case, to overturn a law passed by Congress. Okay? So this differed from Thomas Jefferson's belief that these states... that the states should interpret the Constitution. So back, when we have the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, Jefferson's like, states nullify laws. They can determine whether something's constitutional or not. And Marshall here with the Supreme Court is saying, nope, not quite. That's a power of the Supreme Court. Okay, that's a power of the Supreme Court. So Marbury versus Madison equals judicial review. Now, what does this mean big picture-wise between John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson? Well, John Marshall, like we said earlier, is a Federalist. All right? And Thomas Jefferson, as we know, is a Republican. So with this, of course, John Marshall wants a strong central government, okay, and he's going to use the courts to help create that. Thomas Jefferson still states' rights, okay, advocate. National Bank, John Marshall thinks it's constitutional because he has that loose interpretation, that loose construction, and Thomas Jefferson says unconstitutional because he's got that strict interpretation. Okay? Once again, for economic development, John Marshall is much more focused on commerce, like trade and industry, and Thomas Jefferson is all about that agriculture. Now remember, Thomas Jefferson is a Southerner. He's a plantation owner. Okay, agriculture is something he knows very well. Strict and loose construction of the Constitution. John Marshall is loose. and Thomas Jefferson is strict. All right, and then, of course, we just went over who interprets the Constitution. According to John Marshall, it was the Supreme Court. And according to Thomas Jefferson, it was the states. And that's that. That's standard 1.